Yes, good evening. This is a quick video just to discuss rent to own, real estate investment, and rent to own. I've had a lot of people that have contacted me inquiring about this type of investment. It seems like a quick and easy way to kind of own a property, and there are a lot of advantages, and a lot of people are interested in it. However, there are also a lot of risks that I think most people don't consider initially, and so I just wanted to just give a quick rundown on what are the risk reward ratio, or the factors that the pros and cons of this type of investment, so that you could consider these things going into your negotiations. Okay, so first of all, my name is Cordero Taylor. I am a real estate investor. I also own a property management company that deals with real estate sales, property management, and maintenance, and rentals. I worked in mortgage banking for 10 years. I currently work at a bank primarily focused on consumer loans. However, we also assist persons with property loans and mortgages for qualified borrowers. So I am very much familiar with real estate investing, financing, the legal side of it, foreclosures. I worked 5 years in mortgage foreclosures, specifically dealing with repossessions and restructuring and so forth. And so, the insight that I have is kind of in depth, and I just want to share it because I've had a lot of clients inquiring on it. So, first of all, who is this type of investment for? Now, typically, the persons that are really interested in a rent to own property would be those persons who cannot qualify for a traditional mortgage, or who don't have sufficient funds on hand to complete a cash sale. So that would generally be, if you can't qualify, it's normally either because you may be a self-employed person, and for self-employed persons, typically what you find is, especially in the Bahamas, we don't normally have the proper banking records to support our finances that we could present to the bank and say, hey, listen, this is how much I make. So there's no proof of income. Then you may be a person with existing debt. A lot of persons have consumer loans that may be preventing them, or have their salaries tied up. You may be a person with multiple properties, and holding multiple properties. What you find is, when you go to a bank to negotiate for an additional property, either they want you to pledge all of your properties and tie them all into a whole new financing arrangement, or they would require you to come up with a large lump sum. And it's because typically the down payment for an investment is normally between 25 to 30%, as opposed to if it's a residential property that you're purchasing for your own family to live in, your down payment would typically be between 5 and 10%. And so the bank typically feels as though you're a higher risk for them. You're more likely to default on the loan. If it's for an investment purpose, you can kind of walk away. And so to protect themselves, they ask you to bring in a higher down payment. All right. This may also be for persons who are just familiar with real estate and property management and maintenance, and you just figure, hey, it may be in my best interest to avoid paying all of those additional costs, especially interest costs, to the banker, right? So you could save a lot of money going this rent to own route. But once again, there are certain risks that you have to consider in order to properly balance that reward. All right. So as we're talking about the financing side of it, we should probably cover that first. And so in a rent to own arrangement, typically you find that you're required to come up with a down payment. Now, any real estate venture, you're gonna come up with a down payment. However, in a rent to own, the down payment is typically, it's not presented as a percentage of the investment. Normally, it's a flat rate. So normally they would say, listen, come up with 10 grand, and that gives you the right to own, or we could sign this agreement, or you come up with 15,000. Whereas if you go through a bank, they would normally say your down payment is 5% of the purchase price, or 10% of the purchase price. And so it's not a flat figure. Typically in rent to owns, you just have a flat figure down payment that they ask you for. The next thing you want to consider would be your monthly payments. And so when dealing with monthly payments, it could get kind of technical, and it really depends a lot on the legal scope of it, meaning what type of agreement. So you got rent credits, and then you have payments that reduce the actual purchase price. And let me just explain it a little bit, right? So there are two different laws that come into play with this type of contract. The first law is a landlord and tenant law, which is typical for any renters. So if you're renting from somebody and there's a legal issue that has to be disputed or adjudicated by a court, you would fall under the Landlord and Tenancy Act. And then there's a second law where if you're purchasing something on a monthly payment schedule as a straight up purchase, you would fall under the legal scope of the Hire Purchase Act, which is HIRE Purchase Act. Now, the Hire Purchase Act have certain stipulations and rights and responsibilities for each of the persons on the agreement, for the buyer and the seller. And so it's just two different laws that would apply in the court system. And so when you're dealing with your monthly payments, then if you have reducing purchase price for each monthly payment, typically you would fall under the Hire Purchase Act. Whereas if you have what they call rent credits, typically you would fall under the Landlord and Tenant Act. So if there's an issue that needs to be disputed, it's easy to figure out which act you fall under based on which one of your monthly payments would apply. Now, what do I mean when I say rent credits? A rent credit is simply saying that, okay, you're taking possession of the property, you're living in the property, and so you're really a renter. But because you've given us a down payment, we're going to take a portion of the amount you pay for rent every month and put that toward the agreement to purchase, or put a portion toward your down payment to purchase, right? And so, it's all based on contract law, by the way. Rent to own arrangements is all based on contract law, which means that all of these terms are negotiable. Most persons, when they go to negotiate, they negotiate on price, but they forget that terms oftentimes could affect you in the long run, and we're going to discuss a lot more detail in the terms in terms. What are the terms that you want to negotiate for that will give you the best benefit? So if you're getting a rent credit, let's just say it's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home. It's in a nice area. You like it. You could see yourself living there. The owner of the property says, "Hey, listen, give me a $10,000 down payment to reserve your rights as to purchase this property, and you're gonna pay $1,200 a month." So you ask the owner, "Okay, I'm paying $1,200 a month. Is all of that going to reduce the purchase price?" No, you get rent credit. So what percentage or what portion of my $1,200 goes toward rent credit? They say, okay, 400 or 500 or 600 goes toward rent credit. What is my rent credit going to be used for? Is my rent credit going to act as additional down payment, or is my rent credit going to reduce the actual purchase price of the property? So even though you got one that's just strictly reducing the purchase price, where you fall under the Hire Purchase Act, but under the Landlord and Tenant Act, if you draft the contract the right way, you could still negotiate for a portion of your monthly payments to reduce the purchase price based on how you negotiate and the terms that you build into your contract, right? So the next thing you'd want to know then is obviously, what does the down payment cover, right? So if you make a big down payment, does the down payment act as a portion off of the actual sale price? So in a traditional real estate investment, if the home costs $100,000 and you come with a 5%, that's $5,000 down. So 100,000 minus 5,000, your loan or your mortgage would be $95,000. You get it. You only owe the seller $95,000 in a loan. In a rent to own agreement, it's not always that case. And so if you're buying a home for 100,000, they tell you $5,000 is your down payment. But you say, what is the $5,000 for? They may say the $5,000 reserves your right to purchase at a later date. And it doesn't contribute at all toward the original $100,000 that you're asking for. Once again, it's a bit technical, but it's all based on how you negotiate and the terms that you draft in the contract, and you need to be aware of it. So what do I mean when I say the option to buy? So a rent to own, if you fall under the Landlord and Tenant Act, typically what they would do is they would say you're renting this property for $1,000, but within a 3-year time frame, we're giving you the right to purchase this property, exclusive right to purchase this property at a reserve price. And that's normally the catch there. So they reserve the price for you, meaning that if property values were to go up, then they're not going to increase the cost on you. And if property values were to go down, you can come back and renegotiate. You're reserving the price, it's built into the contract, and that original down payment reserves your right to execute that buying option sometime in the future. The second thing you would want to consider, or another part of the financial arrangement, I believe this may be the third thing, would be taxes. So if you're doing a rent to own arrangement and the real property tax comes due on the property, who is liable for those taxes? Right? If the government decides that they're stepping in to take the property, what happens to my investment? Am I responsible now? Do I have to now find that money? Now, a lot of Bahamians typically in residential properties, they don't consider real property tax as an expense. Um, Most definitely in commercial property or investment properties, you have to consider taxes. And in a lot of instances, even if it's a residential, you may find that real property tax accrues and the buyer or the seller would have to negotiate whose liability or responsibility of those taxes are. What are the responsibility? Who bears that burden? I could recall a recent case in the Bahamas where a parliamentarian would have signed a purchase agreement. I believe it was a hire purchase agreement, but I could be wrong. But I know certainly was a rental one type of arrangement where it was a commercial property and they didn't pay the taxes. So the original owner may have been being pressured by the government to settle those taxes. And if you own a business, a lot of things are tied into your taxes. And so if you're selling a property to a person and you expect them to pay the real property tax and they don't, that may hinder your ability to conduct business, because the title is typically still in the name of the seller in a rent to own arrangement. And we'll discuss title issues in a minute. However, in this particular case, the buyer made all of their payments to the owner, but they didn't fulfill the tax obligation. And the owner put them in court and made them default on the loan or on the purchase because refusal to settle taxes. And this is a parliamentarian. So the purchaser lost the investment because they didn't settle taxes. And taxes is very important. I won't linger on that. Another thing you have to consider is renovation costs, right? Who is responsible for the upkeep and general maintenance of the property? In a landlord and tenant typical arrangement, the landlord is responsible. The tenant kind of is able to pass all those responsibilities on to the landlord. But in a rent to own arrangement, because you're vested into the property, you certainly want to identify whose obligation it is to deal with certain maintenance issues. Insurance is a big thing. Whose responsibility is it to pay the insurance on the property, and who benefits? Who's the beneficiary of the insurance, right? So if there's a flood, if there's a storm, who's going to be able to get the claim on that insurance settlement? Who's going to be able to negotiate with the insurance adjusters? Who has that right? Payment records and tracking. This is a big issue, especially in the Bahamas. So a lot of persons kind of go with gentleman agreements or shake of a hand type of agreements where they don't formalize the payments. And let's just say you have a rent to own for a 5 year, buy a purchase price, and the first year you pay good, the second year you pay all right, the third year you start to be a little shaky. How do you track those payments? How do you keep those proper records? You need to spell out the payment tracking in the contract so that if there's an issue that needs to be adjudicated by a court, they can say these are the terms that you were expected to abide by. Why didn't you? So normally I would advise anybody who's doing a rent to own to make all payments through a financial institution directly to the bank numbers that's reflected on the contract. And oftentimes you pay through an attorney because the attorney is going to have to represent you in the event of an issue, right? And so that payment tracking is important when it comes time to exercise your buying options, and we'll discuss that. But it's also important when it comes time to deal with a default claim or eviction. And so it's extremely important. Next, and probably something I should have discussed first of all, but outside of finance, is the legal scope and title issues. So we already discussed the different types of laws that would apply in terms of Landlord and Tenant Act versus the Hire Purchase Act. But when it comes down to the title, so if you're going to get a mortgage from a bank, the bank would insist that you have a title search. That title search would reveal that the person selling you the property has clear and marketable title to sell that property. In a rent to own arrangement, what you find is because it's like a shortcut, you may decide that you don't want to pay those legal fees right now. But how do you know that the seller actually has the rights to sell you this property? How do you know that the person who was putting himself forward as a seller, didn't inherit the property through their father or mother who passed away, and they share title with a sibling? And while they may be able to give you the right to occupy, they may not have the right to sell outright. So you have to be careful there when it comes down to title. You also have to consider, when you're dealing with title, you have to consider the terms relating to death. So if the seller dies in the middle of your transaction, his interest is now inherited by his family members. And are they obligated to honor your contract? Or they may decide they want to live in the place and they don't need your money. If you die in the middle of the contract and your family now has to take ownership of this obligation, will their rights be protected if you pass away? So what happens to the title in the event of death of the buyer or the death of the seller? It's important. I got here the title as it relates to the option to buy and the reserve price. And so will title be transferred to you within the 3 year if you have an option to buy? When will title be transferred to you? So if it's a typical mortgage, title is transferred to you upon settlement. So you sign a sales agreement, you put down your down payment, you go to the bank, you say, put this in my name. The bank then puts it in your name and then takes a mortgage or a lien against the property, right? In this arrangement, in a rent to own arrangement, because you're not exchanging title until the person is paid off, then you need to determine whether you're paying off the full balance, which is the full 100,000. You won't get title until the full 100,000 is paid off. Or is it a situation where you got 3 years to rent and make up your mind whether you want to exercise your option to buy? And when you exercise your option to buy, I need you to pay me off in full. And then, if you get your money, you pay me off in full. We already discussed that part of it in financing. What happens in the event of a default? What are the rights of the seller? What are the rights of the buyer? And this is extremely important once again. So as a regular tenant, the Landlord and Tenant Act protects the the owner, the landlord, as well as it gives protection to the tenant. So it says typically you got 3 payments to default. If you default, then you get applied to the court to have the person evicted. And once the court gives a certain notice or whatever, they have to move. But you can't just go and kick a tenant out because they may have missed a payment, they may have missed 6 payments, they may have missed a year of payments. But if you don't get a court to put them out, you can't put them out. And so in a typical mortgage, 3 months the banks normally give you before they start the legal process to take you out. And then even after that 3 months, that initial 3 months, there's normally so much processes and legal stuff that have to be conducted that you may have more time to live in a property in default than you would have that is as a mortgagee than you would have to live in a property as a tenant. But as a tenant buyer, you need to determine what is going to be the process if I default. Does he apply to the courts as if I was just a regular tenant? Or will the courts consider me a owner? How will my payments toward the investment be considered in this obligation? And so forth. And normally what I advise my clients to do is when you sign a rent to own, sign it based on the annual figure, even if you intend to pay monthly. So you would basically say that $12,000 is due at the end of this year, in each year, right? 12,000, 12,000, 12,000. That's 36,000, and then at the end of the third year, you have to exercise your right to purchase, right? So what is $12,000 a year? That's $1,000 a month. You could pay $1,000 a month, but contractually you're obligated to pay $12,000 a year. And what that does for the courts is that says, okay, you may have only missed 1 year, or you may have missed a half a year. So the courts adjudicating the matter, they will say, okay, you made 2 years payments, you made a half of the next payment, so this isn't necessarily a default. And it's a kind of a tricky way to protect yourself as a buyer from default, to make sure that, because you have to invest so much in the property, particularly with maintenance and renovations, and so forth. So you just want to protect yourself as much as possible, right? The next thing that you would want to consider would be force majeure, FORCEMAJEUR, force majeure. Now, this is a clause that typically falls in contracts and it relates to unexpected events. So, what happens if there's war? What happens if there's riot? What happens if there's a pandemic or an epidemic? What happens if you have a hurricane or a storm? If the land is destroyed, if the economy is destroyed, acts of God. How does that affect the terms of the agreement? And so you just need to have that spelled out where you say, okay, if some unforeseeable situation were to happen, it's not based on neglect or malfeasance. It's simply a case where, it's unavoidable. And so what, you just gonna put me out? All my interest is gone now because the storm come. It don't matter. You have to spell that out. And then I got here also collecting benefits in a storm, and I think I covered that with insurance when I talked about the insurance side of it. But typically saying, well, okay, listen, if an insurance happens, and I'm making the payments because I'm not title holder, will they give me the benefits? Will I be allowed to collect the benefits of the claim? If a storm happens and the roof is blown off, and I fix the roof out of pocket as a tenant buyer, and you get an insurance claim, are you going to keep the money or are you going to repay me? Right? So who's going to benefit? Who's going to collect? Also, you got to consider what are your rights to sublease, or whether it's strictly your right to occupy. Right? So, for instance, if you're a tenant buyer, the landlord might say, man, listen, you're a family of 3, and I give you the right to stay here until you exercise your purchase option. However, you can't put no more people, no more human bodies in here, because then the wear and tear on the building is going to be too much. And so we're not prepared to allow you to rent this out to anybody, or to even increase the number of occupants beyond what's considered reasonable. And so they may put restrictions on your rights to sublease and on your rights to number of occupants. Um, Finally, I got here transitioning into title ownership when the option to buy must be enforced, and so it's important to consider what are the terms surrounding that transition. So if you have a rent to own agreement with an option to buy within a time frame, how do I exercise that option? Do I have to sign a new sales agreement, or will this original agreement have sufficient terms in it that acts as a sales agreement and recognizes my investment so far? Do I have to get bank financing? Um, like, is it starting over? Is there a closing date on that transaction? Meaning, if I exercise my right on the third year to buy, do I have to have you paid out within 90 days, or could it be extended? You exercise, or you express your intention to buy within the 3 years, but you have up to another year to pay it off, right? So what are the options? What are the protocols and so forth associated with rent to own? So this is a long video. I don't want to linger on it too much. What I would say in final thoughts is, if you're one of those persons that this is the type of investment for you, whether you can qualify or whether you just specialize in real estate, or you want to save money from paying the bank all of those interests, I would say all of these terms are negotiable, and you should approach each situation with a full understanding that the right terms can make a winning contract, whereas don't just focus solely on the price. Also, I'd want to say, this is not legal advice. All of these stuff that are covered here in this contract and a whole lot more would have to be put on the table by a lawyer. You would want to find a good lawyer who is going to represent your interests. If you're going to pay legal fees upfront to have a title search conducted, you want to know whether those costs, how much that's going to cost. You want to consider whether your down payment is going to be refundable, and whether it diminishes. So maybe it's fully refundable up to the first year, 50% refundable after the second year, non-refundable after the third year, that kind of thing. So those are the kind of things that you want to negotiate for, in addition to everything else that I would have put inside this long video. So just some stuff to consider when you're thinking about rent to own arrangements.